person is involved in the world, he has a job, he or she has a job, and is obviously anchored by the job, in that which they can't necessarily go and learn Torah whenever they want, whenever they at their first opportunity, because they're busy with their job and their mind is occupied with it. So, was that echoing? The apex of divine service that exists in the world is when somebody who's involved in the world, who has a job, who's engaged and almost subsumed in worldly matters, takes from his free time to go and learn Torah. That is the greatest, the apex, the climax of any divine service that could possibly be provided. It's more than the person who's learning all day, and perhaps in a certain sense more greater than the shliach. He's the person who has to be involved in the world, and yet nevertheless sets aside from his free time to go learn Torah. And therefore this is a very special, it's a very close to be in your presence and to be able to discuss matters of Torah together. And hopefully long before the end of this short discussion, we will be learning Torah together in Yerushalayim, and because we'll have already been zeicha to all of we'll have fulfilled our purpose in creating the Dir B'Tachtonim, thanks to our involvement in Torah, particularly in our free time. So I want to just start off firstly with a hakdama, an introduction. I was given two different titles to this Tvar Torah, to this speech, whatever it is, to the shir. The first was, "Can I trust my doctor?" And the second was perhaps slightly more part of the medical issue of blind faith. I'll explain it. Now, without getting into the nitty-gritty of how I got two and not just one, it's definitely not my intention, and even if it was my intention, it's not my place to be raising questions in people's head about their doctors or about how people should be conducting themselves when it comes to medical issues. The Rebbe's advice in this regard is clear and is obvious, and that is that we have an Aseh L'Charav, we have a Rav, and we have a Rofi Yedid, we have a doctor who is a friend, a frum doctor who is a friend, and who we can trust. And these are the people who we turn to for this kind of guidance. Our discussion here is going to be mostly theoretical, just discussing the Torah's perspective. What for? If seemingly we already know how we're supposed to act, and there's no implications of this shir on Kollel Mamash, then what are we here discussing? What's the point? What's the purpose? The purpose for this is that, or can be understood perhaps, with a couple of stories, interesting stories. The Gemara discusses a story of a particular person who, or it's a theoretical story, which perhaps happens in a certain sense in every person's life, where there is a ganav, a person who's who's going to steal, and he's about to enter into the tunnel to steal some sort of whatever it is. He has his eyes on a particular treasure, and he's getting ready. He's getting ready to go into the tunnel. And where does he start off? He starts off, Hashem, God, please help me. Help me get through this. Help me convert it. It needs to be a good return. I need to get it clean. I don't want to get messy over here. And the obvious question the Gemara is asking or implying in discussing this case is, I don't understand. You're living a life of spiritual schizophrenia, so to speak, where on the one hand, you're saying that I believe in the efficacy and in the validity of Hashem and of praying to Him, and how Hashem can actually help me if He wants to. And at the same time, you're going and doing something which is so morally wrong and absolutely against what the same Torah says you shouldn't do. How does this work? How can we do these two things together? How do they go together? So there is a story, and there's clearly a difference between these 2 points. Yet, there is a story where the story is recorded in Gemara Megillah, where a person passed away, and Rav Nachman was asked to deliver a eulogy on his behalf. Rav Nachman says, a eulogy? What should I eulogize him with? a bag of books has passed away. What did he mean by this? Well, many people, in a certain sense, can embody this Ganav personality, but in a slightly more acute kind of way, where on the one hand, we spend time learning halachas, we spend time learning Torah, and at the same time, our knowledge accumulates, we become more proficient, we have access at our fingertips to the breadth of Torah, but it does not infiltrate, it does not pervade, it doesn't penetrate the person himself. And therefore, he remains the person, and the Torah remains Torah. And I know a lot of this Torah. I have not allowed myself to be overcome, overwhelmed, and most importantly, to be taught by the Torah how to change myself, how to adopt the precepts, the beliefs of Torah in my own life. Adopt and adapt, of course. And this is what Rav Nachman meant with this eulogy, that there was a person here, he was proficient in the halachas. The Gemara says he was proficient in halachas, in the Sifra, in the Sifri, in many, many different texts, but the texts remain separate, disparate from him in his life. And therefore, all we can say was that a bag of books had passed away. Similarly, interestingly, there's a verse shared in the Zohar, that the word chamoir, donkey, can be an acronym for Chacham Mufla V'Rav Rabbanim, a wondrous sage and a rabbi of rabbis. There is a person whose mastery in Torah can be wondrous, can be astonishing. And yet together with that, and he could be a rabbi, he could be leading the seminary for rabbis themselves. And together with that, his title spells out the word chamoir, donkey. Who is this donkey? This is the donkey who remains insensitive, who remains detached from what he's learned. He bears the load of all this Torah that he's learned throughout his life, but he hasn't allowed it to penetrate, to become one with him. There's a famous story of Rabbi Yossi, who, according to the Rebbe, in fact, there isn't necessarily, it was the same person as the Shpala Zeder of Aryeh Leib of Shpala. And Rabbi Yossi said that he traveled far and wide throughout Europe to find eventually the Maggid of Mezrich. What did he go there to find? He went there not to learn Torah from the Maggid of Mezrich. He went there to watch the Maggid tie and untie his shoelaces. What is the meaning of this? The meaning of this is that when Torah is learned how it's supposed to be learned, every action, every facet of a person's life is inspired, is infused with the power, the excitement, the passion, the emotion of Torah. And therefore, less exciting for a tzaddik and a master of Torah like Rabbi Yossi was to find another Talmid Chacham. It's beautiful, yeah. And perhaps the insights of the Maggid were unfound anywhere else, but I wasn't coming for that. I was coming to see somebody who's so personified, who's so identified, who identified, so to speak, himself with the lessons that Torah taught, that he himself, when he tie and untie his laces, that would be the greatest conveyance, the greatest display of Torah true Judaism. He was almost a living Torah. What is the relevance to this? Well, in life and in the world, there are many different personalities, many different ways. There are some people who naturally incline in the direction of perhaps conspiracy or mistrust. There are others who are more conservative or are more trusting, and so on and so forth. There's a whole spectrum of different personalities, different people who can understand and perceive things in different ways. But the real dira b'tachtonim that we were speaking about just before, where the Jew working in the world goes and sets aside time to learn Torah, is true also within the person themselves, where we have our worldly perspective, we have our natural gravitation, our natural inclination to a particular way. And then there is what Torah says. And our role as Torah Jews is to first experience what Torah says, allow that to properly inculcate and pervade our entire existence, and on that basis to create our perceptions in the world and our perceptions in life as in general. And therefore, there's a lot of relevance to our talk today. Because even as we're not going to discuss vaccines, definitely not. We're not going to discuss anything, God forbid, we're not going to discuss politics, no political agendas, nothing, literally nothing. We're going to discuss, and definitely not particular people, we're going to discuss medical research and the Torah's view, or some of the Torah's view, on our approach to medical advances. Together with this, we have to remember the necessary prerequisite for the adopting of the right views is having Torah's view first. Reading the words, not reading perceptions and my opinions into the Torah, but reading what Torah has to tell me, and after that, on that basis, going and conducting my life. So this is an important hakdama that I wanted to make, that besides the fact that we're not discussing politics, of course, that what we're going to discuss today is a drop in the ocean of some of Torah's greatest sages and scholars and how they answered actual halachic questions in the fields of medical administration, and the extent to which they were able to rely upon doctors in the area or this same medical research, how that impacted halacha and how it impacted medical medicine in general. And therefore, once we're talking about the unity in the Torah, where the Torah becomes one with us, then we can also talk about unity amongst Yidden. That when it comes to Avas Yisrael, a love of a fellow Jew, the Alter Rebbe quotes Hillel HaZaken as saying that this is the entire Torah and everything else is but commentary. That is to say that even, or like we have from the students of Rabbi Akiva, who Rabbi Akiva had an academy of 24,000 students, all of whom passed away as a result of their inability to conduct themselves with each other in a way of respect. And the famous question that the Rebbe poses is that this is how to understand. Rabbi Akiva himself is a person who says, this is the general rule in the Torah. We love our fellow Jews as ourselves. How could it be that the very same Rabbi Akiva students, 24,000 of them, they all died because they couldn't behave with Avos Yisrael? How did they so radically miss everything that their teacher stood for? And the Rebbe explains that it wasn't due to their lack of Avos Yisrael, but to the contrary. It was because of their great quote-unquote Avos Yisrael that they were not able to conduct themselves with respect for each other, because each of them had their own way of perceiving a given halach in Torah, and I care about you so much. How can I watch you go and behave from the way that I see the truth? I need to care about you. I need to share with you the truth as I see it, and this truth you need to follow as well. And because they were unable to share this, or to allow their perception, their understanding, and their colleagues' understandings, this was what resulted in the deficiency in their Avos Yisrael, so to speak, and the terrible plague that occurred afterwards. Now, one final hakdama, we're introducing for a long time. One final hakdama I want to say is that we are discussing here something which, in this year itself, we're going to touch, like I said, a drop in the ocean. There's the famous discussion of why Judaism never encouraged, to begin with, before the revolution and all these things in times of the Rambam. Why did Judaism not encourage the study of philosophy? And one of the explanations given is because when we read books of philosophy, philosophy has questions and it gives answers. And what if one day, God forbid, Yankel, whatever his name is reading a book of philosophy, and he understands the question and he doesn't understand the answer. And then he puts down the book and he goes to sleep. So that night, Yankel is going to go to sleep not believing in Hashem. He will have a real question on the existence of God. He will not have understood the answer, or maybe he won't have gotten to the answer yet. And that night, he will be, so to speak, he will live a godless existence, God forbid. God forbid, right? And for that reason, the study of philosophy was something which was always, it was necessary to have gloves, make sure to touch deal with care, very fragile, only involved in a certain sense and with the right hadracha, the right guidance to learn. In our case as well, we're going to touch on a lot of different people, a lot of different opinions, hopefully, if you have time. We're going to touch on a lot of different opinions, answers that different poskim gave throughout the time. We're going to touch on a few sources that kind of the PowerPoint, unfortunately. So hopefully we'll make it as engaging as possible. But it's possible to kind of tap in and tap out, latch in, latch out, and only have gotten one or two, or whatever it is, messages from this year. And I feel a responsibility to share that, after all, this entire year is nothing but a drop in the ocean. We're introducing some of the concepts, some of the different ways, different outlooks on this touchy subject. And one should not come to a conclusive view on Torah's view on medical veracity on the basis of not one point of this year, nor the entire year. We're just going to open up some of the doors. We're going to discuss some of the questions and some of the ways that some of the people have dealt with it. And therefore, if we tap in or tap out, if we hear a number of different opinions, or even just one opinion, let's understand that this is just one opinion, it's just one view, and like we said earlier, for the purposes of actual implementation, consult your local Orthodox rabbi and doctor. All right, so there went our introduction, our Hakdama. The foundation of medicine in Torah is a very interesting one, because we see in the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yossi Gopin says, the Torah granted permission to a doctor to heal. What does it even mean? The Torah granted permission for a doctor to heal. Seemingly, we'll come to this discussion point soon. Seemingly, the doctor knows how to heal. The Torah doesn't need a grant permission for a doctor to heal. Why is it that the concept of medicine is dealt in such a way that it's permission granted from God to grant healing, to cure, to help people through medicine? And together with that, somehow, the Tur and Rabbi Yossi Gopin, both of them, two of the greatest halachic codifiers of history, they both say, mitzvahi. The Torah grants permission to the doctor to heal, and it is a mitzvah to heal. How do those two things go together? Either it's going to be permission granted, and if you can't do anything else, then I guess you'll do it. Or it's a mitzvah, and if it's a mitzvah, you don't need to give permission. There's a commandment to do it. It's a mitzvah. So Rabbeinu David Halevi, the Taz, comments on the Shulchan Aruch and addresses this exact question. And he explains that the pasuk says in Hazinu, Machatzi v'ani erpa, Hashem says, I afflict. I am the one who gives sickness, and I am the one who heals. Or Hani Hashem Reifech, we have as well. Hashem is our true healer. Hashem is the Reifech Chol Basar. He is the healer of all flesh. In that case, what does the doctor have to do with anything? And in fact, that was the truth of the matter for a long time, in a certain sense, or at least theoretically, this is how the concept of medicine should have been regarded. That doctors should not have been engaged, and instead, one should pray to Hashem. Hashem is the one who gave this sickness. Hashem is the one who will heal. And therefore, it is our responsibility to daven to Hashem and to not consider the ways of the world, not to consider the natural, so to speak, ways of healing ourselves. And an issue arises that seemingly not every single person is always zeicher to a nes from Shamayim. Yes, that's true, that Hashem can heal, but a person requires extensive merit. A person requires a real powerful prayer to be answered. And God would forbid it, that we should only, so to speak, rely on God in the absence of such great zchus, and resultingly not be healed from many things because we're not deserving. And therefore, Hashem granted the concept of refuah, of healing, to Teva, to nature, and he allowed it to be something which is practiced and shared and administered even amongst Jews. So much so is this the case that Rav Acha, one of the Amoraim in the Gemara, instituted a prayer to be said upon entering to let blood. Letting blood was a special way of healing in olden times. From time to time they needed to let blood. There was a special method, a way that they were supposed to behave on that day. They couldn't do certain things, they could do certain things, they could eat specific things and not, and so on and so forth. They weren't supposed to fast. But Rabbi Acha instituted an interesting tefillah, a prayer to be said by someone who goes to let blood. May it be the will before you that this letting of blood should be a refuah for me, and you, Hashem, should heal me, for you are the trustworthy, you are the the trustworthy healer and doctor, so to speak. Your healing is true, and it is not the way of man to heal. So this is very reminiscent of that ganef, where on the one hand we're saying, yes, Hashem, you are the healer, and yet at the same time I'm going to go, it is not the way of mankind to heal, but I'm going to do natural means to cure myself. Hashem, please heal me. And there's a machlokes in the Gemara whether this is actually to be instituted like this. Maybe it is the way of humankind to heal. That is to say, once Hashem grants refuah, once Hashem grants healing and a cure to nature, perhaps now it becomes our mitzvah to administer this, and therefore we don't need to say that it is not the way of humankind to heal. And this, in fact, is accepted in the halacha by the Taz, that the refuah, the healing, is a mitzvah. And this is the reason why the Torah and the Beis Yosef say the word mitzvahi. It is a mitzvah to administer healing and cure and medicine, these kinds of things for a doctor to practice. This is a mitzvah because once we've come to the point where people are not necessarily deserving of miracles every time they become sick, so it is necessary to engage in the medical side of things, medicine and doctors, and this is a mitzvah for the doctor. And similarly, an obligation for the patient. However, now that we're here, there are famous opinions. There are famous opinions who aren't so quick to accept doctoral veracity, medicine, these kinds of things. Famously, more recently, Rabbi Nachman, the famous Rabbi Nachman, the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, was very against doctors, very against medicine. And he explained that all sickness comes from God. And the reason why the sickness comes from God is because when the neshama inside feels like she's being neglected, she feels like she's not being properly taken care of, she says, what do I need this for? I came down into this world to learn Torah and do mitzvahs, and I'm being neglected. And therefore, she starts kind of shifting, starts trying to leave, so to speak, the body, God forbid. And the only refuah for this is to daven to Hashem, is to do teshuvah. How does medicine work then? So Rabbi Nachman explains that the reason why medicine might sometimes work is because when a person commits to a regimen of discipline, a discipline regimen for medicine, whether things, not eating other things, and so on and so forth, when a person commits, so this discipline is experienced by the neshama senses, it feels that there is something else going on here, there is something changing here, the person has committed himself to something, I can stay. And therefore the sickness will go away. This is how Rabbi Nachman from Breslov, the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, explains the whole concept of sickness and his quite emphatic disagreement with the administration of medicine and practicing of doctors. More recently, there are different opinions. Things were different then, things were not different then. There's government licensing, which we'll touch on soon, hopefully, time permitting. And there are, I guess, different leaders within the Breslover movement some who say you can, and some who say you can't, and so on and so forth. But the Ramban also, much earlier, of course, 1,000 or so years ago, 800, 900 years ago, the Ramban says that similarly, he speaks about this when it comes to the Kollel in Parshas B'Chokosai. He says that even when a tzaddik would become unwell in the times of Nevuah, they would only pray to Hashem. Like Chizkiyahu, we have the story of Chizkiyahu where he became unwell. He was told by the Navi he's going to pass away because he did not engage in Pru Revuah and having children. And what happened? He turned to the wall, he davened to Hashem. The Navi said it's too late. But he davened to Hashem, he said, I'm going to marry. And he actually married the Navi's own daughter. And in fact, his abstaining from marriage was L'Shem Shamayim in a certain sense, because he knew that his children would be Rishonim. But Hashem cured him, Hashem healed him. And so on, and we see throughout, in other stories as well, that tefillah, of course, is the automatic go-to, that from Yitzchak and Rivka, and that he took one corner and he davened, and she took the other corner and she was davened. And Rashi explains who exactly was whose tefillah was being listened to, was being answered when they were granted with the children finally after so many years. But definitely, says the Ramban, that when they say V'rapa Yirapeh in the Torah, that you can heal, you can give refuah, this is referring to he says the words Ein l'roifei lesser atzim emir f'rasei. A person should not prohibit himself from curing, and yet the main avenue should be tefillah. And similarly, we see this in the Rebbe's answers, where very, very often we find that the Rebbe's advice was always very interesting. Rabbi Stern showed me today an answer from the Rebbe, where somebody came to him and said, I have this particular medical issue. The Rebbe said, the doctor is telling you have an issue. Go and strengthen your kashrus, go and strengthen your taras, mishpacha, I think it was, and then go back to the same doctor. He's going to give you a different explanation, different diagnosis. And we see this throughout many of the answers of the Rebbe when it comes to medical matters or healing matters. Very, very often, the Rebbe would emphasize, of course, we have 248 mitzvahs aseh, positive commands, which correspond to the 248 limbs, and 365 mitzvahs aseh, negative commands, which correspond to 365 sinews or veins in our body, and that each corresponds to another part of our body. And by strengthening the particular body part which connects of the Kabbalah to this mitzvah, through this you will cure and heal the particular malady that exists, because that's where it started from. Things start spiritually and then come into physically, to the physical realm of things. Okay, so we definitely see that there's a lot of discussion, and we do not want to negate chas v'shalom, the importance and the central theme that still exists today by Eden, which is strengthening in our yada, strengthening in our bitochen, strengthening in asiyas mitzvahs, and these kinds of things. They help for actual cure. And yet we still see that there is a trust for doctors. And for this, we're going to touch on some of the sources. We don't have the source sheets, so I'll share it outside. And really, we're going to find that there are two different areas in Torah. There is medicine as it pertains to halacha. So there are halachic implications based on the belief of a doctor, which in a certain sense needs to be regarded with more extremity, in a certain sense less. And secondly, we have still medical discussions. So the Gemara discusses a couple of cases. Before the Gemara, we're going to talk about two specific halachas pertaining to Yom Kippur and to Shabbos. When it comes to Yom Kippur, of course, we know that if a person is unwell and a Reifei Baki, a trusted and expert doctor says that they cannot fast, says the Shulchan Aruch, even if he's a Gentile, even if he's an idol worshiper, if he recommends not to fast, we trust him, and the person should not fast. We don't want the person to come in danger by not eating, this unwell person. This would imply that we give categorical belief, we give absolute belief to doctors. And yet, together with that, in the next sentence, we find a seemingly conflicting source where it says that if the doctor says he doesn't need to eat, but the Kollel says he does, if the sick person, if the patient says, I'm going to come to danger if I don't eat today on Yom Kippur, and the doctor says he doesn't need it, we'll believe the patient, which sounds like we don't give absolute belief or absolute trust in the doctor's words. And if the Kollel says that he needs to eat. We give him to eat, even on Yom Kippur. Many different people speak about the implications of these two juxtaposed halachas, where one seemingly implies we do trust absolutely, one seemingly implies we don't trust absolutely. Of course, there is the pasuk that Kollel yidei amaras nafshay, that a patient, a sick person, recognizes, perhaps in a certain sense, even better than a doctor, how they are feeling personally, how he is feeling, and on that basis, we have to give a certain truth. We have to trust the patient's words. And we could discuss whether a regular person off the street would argue with a doctor, whether we'd believe them. And the fact that we wouldn't necessarily shows that there is still a belief in doctors, but perhaps we can say that specifically when it comes to the patient, we trust the patient, and also there's a necessary use of a daita, like Rabbi Yossi was talking about, where a person needs to be at rest. He needs to feel like he's recovering, and that's an important consideration as well. Arguing doctors, these kinds of things, we probably won't get there because we're running out of time. But we might touch on two doctors when they say the same thing in different, not in front of each other. Then there is halacha of Shabbos. Comes to Shabbos, it says any sickness. The doctors say the sickness is a danger. We're machal Shabbos for it, absolutely, and not just that. We go so far as to say that if a person, that you don't even need an expert doctor, even if a regular person says this is dangerous, I think we need to machal Shabbos for this, we can trust it. The Ramah provides a caveat, a necessary caveat, which is that, of course, when it comes to halachic implications, it's necessary to have someone to protect the integrity of the preservation of this halacha. We need to have someone who is a Yirei Shamayim. The doctor, or even the person, the regular person, who's not necessarily proficient in these texts, but he recognizes the danger here, needs to be a Yirei Shamayim. So that is to say that if there is a doctor who isn't observant yet, and or a non-Jewish, a Gentile doctor that could present complications as to the extent that we can believe him, because in the context of halacha, the doctor does not value halacha to the same way that a Jew understands it, it's central to his entire life. And therefore, a doctor's Yirei Shamayim has a certain measure of believability, certainly in terms of Kollel Kashrut, saying we can assume that there are no, that we do assume that there are no personal agendas, there are no anti-Semitic agendas, God forbid, or a lack of care. From Yirei Shamayim doctor cares for a fellow Jew, and therefore there is an element of trust that we give to a from doctor, even over that of an expert non-Jewish or not from doctor. And perhaps people have experienced before, let's say women who are pregnant are encouraged to drink on Yom Kippur, even if they aren't necessarily going through a difficult pregnancy, because doctors don't necessarily understand what's Yom Kippur. I mean, this is life. And the Bir Halach actually picks up on this. Mishnah Berurah says that, quoting from the Tiferes Yisrael, he says that nowadays, I'm not so sure we can trust doctors in the same way we used to be able to, or at least non-Jewish doctors, because they say about any sickness, of course, you can't fast, of course, you have to eat, you have to drink, you have to stay healthy, you have to be strong in order to cure you, in order to become better. And on this basis, it's more difficult for us to believe or to swallow their advice when it comes to Yom Kippur and Shabbos. Let's discuss two more stories in the Gemara, three more stories in the Gemara, or two more stories in one question, because the question is going to introduce a very important precept. Maybe we'll come back to another Gemara soon. We discussed the Chasam Sofer's Shita. There is a question raised in the Gemara. On Zoom here, they're throwing out puns. All right. At least they're listening. Baruch Hashem. The Gemara says, a person who lives in a city without a Jewish doctor, so how should he have his child circumcised? Is it preferable to have an idol worshiper circumcise his child, or to have a Kuthian circumcise his child? And what's the difference? What's the discussion here? Well, an idol worshiper can sometimes have anti-Semitic agendas or a lack of care for the child's actual health, and therefore we are concerned that perhaps he won't perform in the same way. In contrast, but at the same time, circumcision is not part of his beliefs, and therefore, if he does circumcise, the circumcision will not be for the sake of his deity, for the sake of his God. It will be for the sake of Judaism, for the sake of whatever their father wants it to be for. In contrast, the Kuthian, who are the Kuthians? The Kuthians were a nation who converted to Judaism because they were afraid of lions, I believe, and because they were initially accepted as regular mainstream Jews and converts. However, they were once discovered as worshipping a particular dove they found in Har Gerizim. This became their deity, and they circumcised their children for the sake of this deity, and therefore were worried that if a Kuthian will administer the circumcision, it's not only that, we're not worried about the danger involved, but we are worried about him doing the circumcision for the sake of his God. And this presents a problem. What do we do? So, and the answer is we give to the non-Jewish doctor. But why? Not because we're not afraid of the danger, but rather because when there is an expert doctor, the doctor needs to preserve the reputation of his job. The doctor has, the lashon is loy mora umnasei. He doesn't want people to look at him and say, "Oh, he did that circumcision and it wasn't successful for some reason," or the child passed away, Rahman al-Islam. If that word gets out, that will impact his job and his income, his career, his reputation. That's going to be a problem for him, and therefore he says, therefore he will do the job properly. And this is a necessary prerequisite. It's a very important premise that comes out throughout all of the shulis of the poskim, that a doctor needs to preserve his reputation. And so I'm going to see this even more specifically by the time if we get to other Gemaras. We see there's a fellow by the name of Tudus Harefi. Tudus the doctor. Tudus lived in Eretz Yisrael, and he was an expert in anatomy. And it happened once that there was a cow which was brought before Rabbi Tarfon, and the cow's womb had been removed. Rabbi Tarfon said this cow is considered a treifa. This cow is going to die and therefore cannot be shechted for the purpose of, cannot be ritually slaughtered for the purpose of consumption, because if it will be, because it's a treifa, it's going to die anyway, and therefore it is disqualified. Now the story came before the Chachamim. It was revised, so to speak, went to the Third Empire, and they brought this question to the doctor, to Tudus. Tudus says, "What are you talking about? In Alexandria, they never ever allow out cows when they sell en masse their cows. They never allow them out with a womb because it's a unique kind of cow. They don't want cows to procreate, to have children outside of Alexandria, because that will affect their economy. They're worried that it's going to that if they allow the cows to move overseas, to move to other places with their wombs, then they will no longer have the monopoly over this unique kind of cow, this special tasting cow, and yet nevertheless, they were always allowed to be eaten. We never had an issue slaughtering the cows from Alexandria. To the contrary, we know these cows to be the best cows, the best tasting cows. And therefore, Rabbi Tarfon suggests to the Saraife, your disqualification of this cow is unfair, because it does not render a cow a treifa. Right? They would live for many months afterwards, definitely for 12 months, which is the necessary time to be rendered no longer a treifa. And therefore, Rabbi Tarfon had to revise his ruling, and he was worried about having to pay off the person to whom he had ridden off their cow. Another story. That was about animal anatomy, but another story about human anatomy. There is a din when it comes to a nazir. A nazir is not allowed to become tamei l'meis. Nazir cannot become in contact with death of any sort, in other words, with a dead body, or and there are certain quantities of a body. When a body isn't whole or complete, there are certain quantities of the body that are considered enough to either make him impure, or to not make him impure. And the nazir has issues because the nazir is taking a vow upon himself not to become impure, and if he does, he needs to start his vow again for however long it was that he decided to become a nazir. Okay, so there was a particular base Knesset, which was part of the Tarsium community, and they brought in there a box of bones for some reason, and they put it up on a shelf away from everybody. That way, no Nazarites, none of these Nazirim should come into contact in any way with these bones and then be rendered impure and have to start their vow again. Came to the Sarayfe together with all the doctors, says the Gemara. They come in, they look at the bones, and they say, there is not one complete spine in this entire box. And therefore, if there was a complete spine, that would be considered a majority of the body, or it would be considered a majority qualitatively, because it consists of most of the very important part of the body, the spine. And therefore, if there's a full spine, then it would be a problem. To the Sarayfe says, there is absolutely no problem with this box of bones, because this box of bones will be does not consist of one complete spine. And the doctors believed him. Sorry, the rabbis believed him. The Chachamim asked him about it, and they trusted him that this is the case. So we see in the Gemaras themselves that doctors are believed. They are consulted by the rabbis, and they are believed. And similarly, the Maharik, I believe it was a Rishon, Maharik Kollel, I think. The Maharik says that, he's quoted by the Rabbi Yossi, he's definitely a Rishon. He brings a bunch of these cases. He says, look at all these cases in the Gemara where they ask, the rabbis themselves consult with the doctors. And upon the doctor's advice, the rabbis will render a decision, a halachic decision. And from this, we see the doctors can be categorically believed. Maisim B'cholim, says, stories every single day that we rely on the words of doctors when it comes to Yom Kippur, when it comes to Shabbos, and so on and so forth. We do trust and we believe them. In contrast to this opinion is that of the Chassam Sofer. We'll bring one more opinion after this, and we'll close up for snacks. I don't fight with food. The Chassam Sofer has a number of tshuvos, a number of answers, where he argues, he posits a stark contrast to this, across the board acceptance of the Maharik. The Chassam Sofer says, he's asked in a tshuva, a Rav from Mattersdorf sends him a letter. He lived in Pressburg, of course. He received a letter from a Rav in Mattersdorf. There's a particular lady who was having an issue becoming Torah Labaila, being able to be with her husband, and they went to a doctor. The doctor prescribed particular medicines, but the issue was there were no Jewish doctors in town. So what do? I don't know. Can I trust him? Can I not trust him? And the doctor wrote a whole long. So this Rav from Mattersdorf wrote an entire long tshuva himself why he thinks we should believe the doctors, but at the same time he sent also a list of the prescribed medicines that the doctor gave, asking if the Chassam Sofer himself can go and share this with a Jewish doctor in town. That way, the Jewish doctor can ratify, can legitimize this prescription from the non-Jewish doctor in town in Mattersdorf. And the Chassam Sofer says, "Thank you very much. I turned to your question straight away, even though it's right before Pesach. I'm busy with all these other shilas, getting at my own house. But I ask Hashem to help me in answering this question." And basically, he says that medicine needs to be taken in a certain sense with a grain of salt, which means, and the way that he defines this is, that doctors can be believed to say general repercussions of general concepts. For example, stories in the Gemara where there's questions of nidus, and the doctor is believed to say that it could be, there does exist such a thing called a wound, and that could be the source of the tumor by the lady, and for this purpose, we cannot make, or for this reason, we cannot render her a tamea, and so on and so forth. The point is that we have this differentiation between the general notion that there exists sickness and there are available cures for this sickness, but a doctor cannot go and say, this is what's the right thing for you. A doctor can't go and say that, yes, you have, a doctor can say that there exists such a malady in the world, and that this particular cure has been proven statistically or from experiments, it does seem to address this malady, but I can't say that this works for you. And therefore, the Chassam Sofer says, without a doctor here in Pressburg looking at this lady, how could he say that these medicines are right for her? You can't give a generally prescribed medicine and say that this is right for this person necessarily. It's on a person-to-person basis. What's more, and this is fascinating, maybe we'll unravel this a little bit now, as we run out of time. The tests that are done on how do we discern rather which medicine does or doesn't work? Well, they're tested on people. Some are tested on animals, and refer to Rabbi Stern's shir from last year regarding animal experimentation. They're tested on people, but they're also tested on Gentiles for the most part. And the issue with this is that the Gemara says that a Gentile, because a Gentile eats shkotzim or ramasim, he eats creepy crawlies, his body has a different constitution to that of a Jew. It's resulting from what he's eating, and therefore tests administered on a Gentile cannot be applied to Jewish health. And therefore, again, it's possible that in a case-to-case basis, this medication might work for this particular person, but you can't say categorically in a broad sense that this is applicable across the board. Interestingly, this same discussion is brought in an encyclopedia from Rav Avraham Steinberg, and he brings actually a number of different steps of how we deal with this issue of experimentation on Gentiles as opposed to on Jews. Firstly, it is necessary. There is another Gemara elsewhere which says that there was a particular Amar, his name was Rav Shimi Barashi, and he once was curing a guy. He administered refuah for a guy, and the reason he did this was in order to become more proficient, in order to help other Jews, to heal them. So that sounds very strongly like when you give healing to a Gentile, that can be applied across the board, even to Jews as well. Similarly, other tshuvos from the Maharsham, for example, who suggests that yes, it's true, they may consume shkotzim or ramasim, they may eat creepy crawlies, that could change their body temperatures and their general constitution, in that which we can't apply medicine tested on them to Jews necessarily, but that's only in the context of the digestive system. But in all other areas of the Jewish anatomy, it's exactly the same. The only impact that the eating of shkotzim or ramasim, of creepy crawlies, has on the Gentile is in the context of his stomach. And therefore, in his stomach specifically, we can't compare these two. But in all other areas, we can compare experiments on Gentiles to administration on Jews. And finally, suggested by some later poskim, the Minchas Pitzim, and nowadays, being that they don't anyways eat creepy crawlies as much or at all, there's no problem in applying across the board experimentation on Gentiles, even for the Jewish constitution. I want to bring one last explanation. Maybe we'll stop here. We made a small dent in the ocean, in the broad spectrum of many of literally abundant material on this, and just a reminder that this is nothing but a small touch. This is one opinion we discussed, the Chassam Sofer. There are ways that other people explain the Chassam Sofer, interpret them otherwise. So it's not all so clear, not so cut and dry, but we've opened the doors, hopefully, to some of the Jewish issues and the Jewish perspectives when it comes to the medical issue of blind faith. And we daven to Hashem, of course, that he should, like the Rambam says, that when Mashiach comes, will not be no sickness and no problems, and rather we're able to focus entirely on serving Hashem and learning Torah and doing his mitzvahs. May it be today. Amen. Sure.
Blind faith in the medical profession. A couple of weeks we're going to say the mind of us, you have the concept of and They're very different. Shtusa is the minor state. Shtusa, the Uma state, is the low state. It has no basis. So the sense that you put the blind faith, it's based on expression. Once they are experts, we have to just like, I'm not saying how, but just like we have the Muda Satima and Muda, that's not blind faith. That's, we understand because they are exactly there. You have it's where Sable stops, but that's where it will have to be. It's simply here. I want to make this relevant that there's a lot of misinformation that goes around, unfortunately, about COVID. It's based on this. Everyone is an expert now because they can go online and they look at the information and they think they know. And we have to trust the doctors. We have to trust the experts to decide what's the correction or not.
Shukayach, thank you. Sure. Sorry? Go for it. Right?
I have a personal experience on the
Really?
Yeah. About 25 years ago, I went to a doctor and he sent me to a surgeon. The surgeon said, you're going to have a major bowel operation in this area the rest of the day from now on. So I asked the doctor about it.
It's great to be That is to say that when you have a question and you're not sure about it, you go to the doctor. And the other thing is say the same thing, not trust each other. Trust my feet, measure trust. And you say the same thing. You don't go with someone with the other. All right. Second, my best.